What drives a respected man, a family man, and a successful professional to cross the line between morality and obsession? How can a seemingly perfect family hide secrets so dark that their revelation shakes the foundations of an entire community? This is the story of how one man's forbidden desire for his daughter's best friend set off a chain of events that culminated in unimaginable tragedy and left lasting scars on the lives of everyone involved. In the tranquil city of Heidelberg, known for its renowned university and research institutions, a seemingly ideal family was about to become the epicenter of a scandal that would shake the city to its foundations. Karl Mahler, a brilliant physicist of 48, his wife Elizabeth, a respected literature professor, and their 17-year-old daughter Sophie, a model student, embodied the German dream. But behind the curtains of their beautiful townhouse, a storm was brewing that no one could have predicted. It all started on a warm spring afternoon when Sophie brought her best friend, Louisa Weber, home to work on a school project. Louisa, who had just turned 18, was the type of girl who attracted everyone's attention: raven black hair that fell in waves over her shoulders, hazel eyes that seemed to change color depending on the light, and a smile that would make everyone's room lit up. Her presence in the Muller home was frequent, but on this particular day something changed. Karl, who usually spent his afternoons in his study doing complex physics calculations, found himself inexplicably drawn to the living room where the girls were studying. He told himself he was just offering to help, but in reality it was Louisa's melodious laugh that drew him like a magnet. At first Karl fought against these thoughts. He kept telling himself that it was inappropriate, even sick, to be attracted to a girl his daughter's age. He tried to immerse himself even more in his work, to spend more time with Elizabeth, anything to take his mind off Louisa. But with every visit the young girl made to his house, Karl's obsession grew. He started making excuses to be home when Louisa came. He offered to drive the girls to the mall, worked in the front yard when he knew Louisa would come, and even started attending the high school volleyball games where Louisa was the star of the team. Elizabeth, immersed in preparing her lectures and blindly trusting her husband, did not notice the subtle changes in Karl's behavior. For her, her husband's sudden interest in Sophie's activities was just an attempt to be a more present father in his teenage daughter's life. Sophie herself was too busy with her studies and the upcoming high school diploma to notice anything unusual. She also liked seeing her father more involved in her and her friends' lives. She even joked with Louisa that her father had become like another teenager in the group. But while the Muller family lived in a bubble of apparent normality, Karl's mind sank deeper and deeper into a whirlpool of fantasies and forbidden desires. He began dreaming about Louisa and imagining scenarios in which she reciprocated his feelings. In his twisted logic, he convinced himself that there was a special connection between them, that Louisa was sending him subtle signals of interest. Karl's obsession began to interfere with his work. The once brilliant physicist began making errors in his calculations, arriving late to important meetings and becoming distracted during crucial presentations. His colleagues at the university noticed the change, but attributed it to the stress of a particularly demanding project Karl was working on. Things started to change at home too. Karl became more irritable and distant towards Elizabeth. Family dinners, once full of conversation and laughter, became quiet and tense affairs. Elizabeth tried to talk to her husband, worried about his change in behavior, but Karl always had an excuse: work, stress, lack of sleep. Meanwhile, Karl and Louisa's relationship became more and more complicated. He looked for every opportunity to be near her, to talk to her, to accidentally brush her hand when he handed her something. Louisa, initially ignorant of Karl's intentions, began to feel uncomfortable with his constant presence. One day, at a pool party that Sophie had organized at the end of the school year, the situation reached a critical point. Karl, who had drunk more than usual, couldn't take his eyes off Louisa in her swimsuit. When the young girl went into the house to get more drinks, Karl followed her. In the kitchen, out of sight of the other guests, Karl finally crossed the line. He approached Louisa, invaded her personal space, and confessed his feelings to her. He spoke of a forbidden but undeniable love, of how he couldn't stop thinking about her, of how he was sure she felt something for him too. Louisa, horrified and confused, immediately rejected him. She told him he was wrong, that she only saw him as her best friend's father, and that his behavior was unacceptable. She threatened to tell Sophie and Elizabeth everything if he didn't leave her alone. Louisa's rejection was a devastating blow to Carl. In his obsession-warped mind, he was convinced that if he was persistent enough, she would change her mind. This marked the beginning of even more erratic and dangerous behavior. Carl began to stalk Louisa. He spied on her when she went out with her friends, when she went to school, even when she was at home. He installed tracking software on Sophie's phone so he could track Louisa's movements through his daughter's social media updates. Carl's work suffered even more. He made serious mistakes that could have had disastrous consequences if they had not been discovered by his colleagues. Eventually, his manager confronted him and suggested he take time off to address personal issues that were affecting his performance. The situation at home became increasingly tense. Elizabeth noticed that there was something very wrong with her husband, but every time she tried to talk to him, Carl closed himself off or reacted angrily. Sophie also noticed the change in her father and began to feel uncomfortable with his constant presence in her social life. Louisa, for her part, was scared. She had noticed Carl's presence in places where he shouldn't have been. She felt his constant gaze on her. But she was afraid to say something to destroy her best friend's family. Besides, who would believe her? Carl was a respected member of the community, and she was just a teenager. The situation reached its climax on a summer evening. Carl had been drinking all afternoon, tormented by his obsessive thoughts about Louisa. When everyone in the house had gone to bed, he quietly sneaked out and drove to the Weber's house. He waited in his car until the house lights went out. Then, in a state of drunkenness and obsession, he decided that he had to talk to Louisa, convince her that they were meant for each other. He entered the house through a window that he knew was always unlocked. Carl crept quietly through the house to Louisa's room. He found her sleeping, her face illuminated by the moonlight coming through the window. He stood there for a moment, watching her, convinced that this was the moment everything would change. But when Louisa woke up and saw him in her room, terror seized her. She started screaming for help. Carl, desperate to silence her, to prevent anyone from discovering her, did the unthinkable. In a fit of panic and rage, he attacked Louisa. What followed was a whirlwind of violence and horror. Carl, blinded by anger and fear, did not realize how much force he was using until it was too late. When he finally regained control of himself, Louisa lay motionless on the ground, lifeless. The silence that followed was deafening. Carl, paralyzed by horror at what he had done, stared at Louisa's lifeless body, unable to process the reality of the situation. It was only the sound of footsteps in the hallway that finally broke him out of his paralysis. In a state of panic, Carl fled the scene. He climbed out the same window he came in and ran to his car. He drove around aimlessly for hours, his mind a chaos of guilt, fear, and denial. He couldn't believe what he had done, didn't want to believe it. Meanwhile, the discovery of Louisa's body in the Webers' home caused a storm of pain and confusion. Louisa's parents, awakened by the screams, found their daughter and frantically called 911. But it was already too late. The news of Louisa's death spread quickly throughout the small community of Heidelberg. Police began their investigation, interviewing family, friends, and neighbors. No one could imagine who would want to harm such a beloved and joyful young girl. Carl, after hours of aimless driving, finally made a decision. He couldn't live with what he had done. He returned home at dawn to find Elizabeth and Sophie awake, worried about his absence during the night. It was then that Carl, with tears in his eyes and a broken voice, confessed everything. His obsession with Louisa, the harassment, and finally the terrible act he had committed. Elizabeth and Sophie listened in horror, unable to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster who confessed his crimes to them. Sophie, in a state of shock and with shaking hands, was the one who finally called the police. A few minutes later, the quiet street where the Mullers lived filled with sirens and police lights. The neighbors, curious and alarmed, came out of their houses to see Carl being led away in handcuffs. Carl Muller's arrest shook the community to its core. No one could believe that such a respected man, a family man and successful academic, could be capable of such a cruel act. The news spread quickly and became a topic of conversation throughout Heidelberg and beyond. The trial that followed captured national attention. The case was sensational, a respected physicist obsessed with his daughter's underage best friend, culminating in a brutal murder. The media pounced on Heidelberg and turned the peaceful university town into a media circus arena. During the trial, more disturbing details about Carl's obsession emerged. Evidence of his harassing behavior was presented, secretly taken photos, call and message logs, witness statements from people who had noticed his strange behavior around Louisa. Elizabeth testified and described how her husband had changed in the months before the crime, becoming distant and unpredictable. Her testimony was heartbreaking, a woman whose life had been destroyed trying to understand how the man she loved had become a monster. Sophie also testified that her statement was one of the most emotional moments of the trial. She described how she had unwittingly introduced Louisa into her father's life, how she had been blind to the signs of his inappropriate behavior. Her statement was full of guilt and pain, the trauma of not only losing her best friend, but also the image of the father she thought she had. Louisa's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Weber, gave a heartbreaking statement in which they spoke of their daughter, of her dreams and hopes, of the life that had been so cruelly taken away from her. Their pain was palpable in the courtroom, and there was not a dry eye as they finished their testimony. Carl himself pleaded guilty. In his testimony, he tried to explain how his obsession had taken over him, how he had lost control of his actions. But his words rang hollow given the gravity of his crime. At the end of the trial, Carl was sentenced to life imprisonment. The verdict was greeted with a mix of relief and sadness by the community. Justice had been done, but nothing could bring Louisa back or repair the damage that had been done to so many lives. The consequences of Carl's crimes extended far beyond the courtroom. The lives of everyone involved changed forever. Elizabeth, devastated by the betrayal and the loss of the life she knew, could not bear to stay in Heidelberg. Every corner of the city reminded her of the life she had lost, of the lies she had lived. She requested a leave of absence from her job and moved to another city, unable to face the pitying looks and whispers behind her back. The first few months were a hell of depression and self-blame. She constantly wondered how she couldn't have seen the signs, how she could have been so blind to the monster her husband had become. Over time and with the help of intensive therapy, Elizabeth began to rebuild her life. She divorced Carl, a painful but necessary process for her healing. Eventually, she found a job at a small university in Munich where no one knew her past. There she slowly began to rebuild her identity, no longer as Carl Muller's wife, but as Elizabeth Bauer, a strong woman who had survived the unimaginable. Sophie was the most affected by the tragedy. Not only had she lost her best friend in the most brutal way, but she had also lost the father she thought she had. Her world completely collapsed. The first few months after the trial were a whirlwind of nightmares, panic attacks, and deep depression. Unable to stay in Heidelberg, where she was reminded of Louisa and the life they had shared at every corner, Sophie moved to Munich with her mother. She gave up her dreams of studying physics, unable to associate science with anything other than her father's work. Instead, she immersed herself in the study of psychology, determined to understand how the human mind could harbor such dark secrets. The university years were difficult for Sophie. She constantly battled guilt, convinced that she was somehow responsible for what had happened to Louisa. She experienced several episodes of severe depression and anxiety, but with the help of intensive therapy and her mother's unconditional support, she slowly began to heal. It was during her graduate studies that Sophie finally found meaning in her pain. She specialized in forensic psychology, with a particular focus on cases of harassment and obsession. Her personal experience gave her a unique and valuable perspective in this area. She began working with victims of harassment, helping them recognize early warning signs and seek help. 10 years after the tragedy, Sophie published a book called The Silent Obsession: How My Father Became a Murderer. The book, a mix of personal memoirs and psychological analysis, quickly became a bestseller. In it, Sophie explored not only her own story, but also the psychological mechanisms behind obsession and harassment. The book served as a powerful awareness-raising tool and helped many people identify problematic behaviors in their own lives. The book's publication brought a new wave of media attention to the case. Sophie suddenly found herself in the spotlight, giving interviews and taking part in television shows. Although it was painful to relive the tragedy, Sophie remained steadfast in her mission to educate the public and prevent stories like hers from repeating themselves. Meanwhile, Karl Muller was experiencing his own version of hell in the Stamheim Correctional Facility. The first years were the most difficult. He constantly struggled with guilt and remorse over his actions. The nights were torture, plagued by nightmares in which he kept reliving the moment in which he took Luisa's life. Over time, Karl immersed himself in the rehabilitation programs the prison offered. He participated in intensive therapy and support groups for sex offenders. Slowly, he began to understand the magnitude of his actions and the psychological mechanisms that had led him to commit such a terrible act. When Sophie's book was published, Karl read it in his cell. Every word was like a knife in his heart, but he forced himself to keep reading. Seeing the pain he had caused through his daughter's eyes was a devastating but necessary experience. It was then that Karl finally accepted full responsibility for his guilt, without excuses or justifications. In an act of remorse, Karl wrote letters to Elizabeth, Sophie, and Luisa's parents. In these letters, he took full responsibility for his actions, expressed his deep remorse, and asked not for forgiveness, knowing he did not deserve it, but for them to find peace and move on with their lives. He never received a response to these letters, but the act of writing was an important step in his own process of acceptance and repentance. Luisa's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Weber, experienced their own hell after their daughter's death. The first few years were a blur of unimaginable pain. Their home, once full of laughter and music, became a quiet mausoleum of memories. They battled depression and the desire to give up in the face of pain. It was Ms. Weber who finally found a way out of her pain. Inspired by Sophie's work, she decided to channel her suffering into something positive. She founded a nonprofit organization called Luisa's Light, dedicated to educating teens and parents about the dangers of harassment and the importance of recognizing early signs of obsessive behavior. Through Luisa's Light, Mr. and Mrs. Weber began giving lectures in schools and universities. They shared Luisa's story, but also talked about the importance of open communication between parents and children and how to create an environment of trust where teens feel safe to talk about their concerns. Working with the organization gave them a new purpose in life. Although the pain of losing Luisa never completely went away, they found comfort in the thought that her tragedy could help prevent other families from going through the same thing. Over the years, Luisa's Light grew into a respected national organization. They worked closely with schools, law enforcement, and legislators to improve anti-harassment and domestic violence laws. 15 years after the tragedy, the case of Luisa Weber and the Mullers was still a topic of conversation in Heidelberg. The city had changed, but the memory of what had happened remained. It had become something of a local legend, a story told in whispers, a reminder that even in the most peaceful places and seemingly perfect families, dark secrets can lurk. The Mullers' house, which had stood empty for years, was finally sold to a young couple. Before moving in, they carried out a complete renovation, as if to erase any trace of the tragedy. But for the elderly neighbors, the house would always remain a silent reminder of how obsession can destroy lives. At the Heidelberg High School, where Luisa and Sophie were students, an annual scholarship was established in Luisa's memory. Each year it was awarded to a student who demonstrated excellence in volleyball and was committed to preventing harassment and violence. It was a small way to keep Luisa's spirit alive and ensure that her memory continued to inspire new generations. The impact of the case reached beyond Heidelberg. He became a case study in many criminology and forensic psychology programs across the country. Karl Muller's story has been used as an example of how obsession can drive seemingly normal people to commit terrible acts. 20 years after the tragedy, Sophie returned to Heidelberg for the first time since she left. She came to give a talk at the high school as part of a harassment and mental health awareness program. As she drove through the familiar streets, she was hit with a wave of memories, both good and bad. Sophie's talk in the high school auditorium was moving and powerful. She talked about her experiences, about the signs everyone had missed, about the importance of communication and trust. But she also talked about resilience, about how it is possible to rebuild after tragedy. After the lecture, Sophie visited Louisa's grave for the first time in 2 decades. She laid down a bouquet of sunflowers, Louisa's favorite flowers, and spent a moment in silence, remembering the friend she had lost and reflecting on the long and painful journey she had traveled since then. As she walked away from the cemetery, Sophie realized that while the pain would never completely go away, she had found a way to live with it and use her experiences to help others. The tragedy that had destroyed her life had also led her to her calling, to a greater purpose. The story of the Mullers and Louisa Weber remains a dark reminder of how obsession can destroy lives and entire families. But it is also a story of resilience, how it is possible to find light even in the deepest darkness. As the camera moves away from Heidelberg and shows the city from above, a question lingers in the air. How many dark secrets lie behind the perfect facades of the houses that surround us? And more importantly, how can we create a society where victims feel safe to speak out, where signs of dangerous behavior are not overlooked? The tragedy of Louisa Weber and the Muller family reminds us that constant vigilance, open communication, and education are our best weapons against the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected corners of our communities. It's a call to action, a reminder that we all play a role in preventing similar tragedies. As the credits roll, we see a series of images, students taking part in workshops run by Louisa's Light, Sophie giving a talk at a psychology conference, the cover of her best-selling book, and finally a photo of Louisa, smiling, full life and promise, a painful reminder of all that was lost and why this story must be told. The case of Louisa Weber and the Mullers became a turning point in the fields of criminology and forensic psychology. It has been studied at universities across the country and used as a case study on the dangers of uncontrolled obsession and the importance of recognizing early signs of problematic behavior. The impact of the case extended beyond academia. He inspired a number of documentaries, books, and even a feature film. Although Sophie and the Webers refused to participate in most of these projects because they felt they trivialized her experiences, they acknowledged that they were keeping Louisa's memory alive and helping to educate the public about the dangers of harassment and harassment clear-up obsession. Over the years, the story of Louisa and the Mullers became something of a modern fairy tale, a morality tale passed down from one generation to the next. It became a reminder that even in the most peaceful places and seemingly perfect families, dark secrets can lurk. But more than that, it became a story of resilience, how it is possible to find meaning and purpose even after the most devastating tragedy. Sophie's life, her tireless work to prevent the suffering of other families, became a testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome trauma and create positive change. As the camera moves away from Heidelberg one last time and shows the city from above, with its quiet streets and venerable university, the narrator reflects on the lessons learned from this tragedy. He reminds us that constant vigilance, open communication, and education are our best weapons against the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected corners of our communities. The story of Louisa Weber and the Mullers leaves us with one final question. How many dark secrets lie behind the perfect facades of the houses that surround us? And more importantly, what can we do as individuals and as a society to prevent similar tragedies from happening again in the future? As the credits roll, we see a series of images, students participating in Louisa's Light workshops, Sophie giving a talk at a psychology conference, the covers of her books, Mr. and Mrs. Weber receiving an award for their work in violence prevention, the memorial at the Heidelberg High School. The final image is a photo of Louisa, smiling brightly at the camera, full of life and promise. It is a painful reminder of all that was lost, but also a symbol of hope. Louisa's smile, frozen in time, challenges us all to be better, to be more attentive, to care for one another. And so, as the screen slowly fades to black, we are left with the feeling that even though this particular story has come to an end, the work to prevent similar tragedies continues. It is a work that affects us all, a reminder that each of us has the power to make a difference, to pay attention, to speak up when something is wrong. The tragedy of Louisa Weber and the Mullers reminds us that evil can arise in the most unexpected places, but it also shows us that from the ashes of tragedy a purpose, a mission, a light can emerge, guiding others to a safer one and more compassionate future. As the final chord of the music fades away, we are left with a bittersweet feeling, sadness for what was lost, but also hope for what has been achieved since. And with that hope comes a responsibility to stay vigilant, to look out for one another, to ensure that Luisa's story is remembered and that her loss was not in vain. The camera zooms in on Luisa's photo one last time, her radiant smile a silent call to all of us to keep our eyes open, be there for each other, and never underestimate the power of love and compassion to dispel the darkness.